Welcome and welcome back. Last episode, we discussed the current state of the comic industry, looking at how the industry has grown and changed in the past few decades, especially considering the internet boom and the dawn of the digital marketplace. In that, we also talked a bit about how comics are perceived, examining the critical reception of the medium and its fight for legitimacy. We'll be carrying that idea of legitimacy into this episode as well as we further discuss adaptations, franchises, and transmedia convergence, examining the role of comics in our complex media landscape. Both transmedia storytelling and convergence culture are concepts that were popularized by professor, author, and media scholar Henry Jenkins from 2003 and 2006 respectively. But just what is transmedia convergence? Let's break it down. Transmedia is a term that describes works, approaches, or franchises that create unique content across multiple mediums to contribute to one unified understanding or experience. In terms of transmedia storytelling, that may look like the Star Wars franchise, where the movies, comics, animated series, novels, games, and various other media can be enjoyed independently, but also all contribute to a greater canon and expanded universe. Transmedia has become a popular buzzword in media analysis. It's often confused or used interchangeably with terms like multimedia or cross-platform. But transmedia isn't just a synonym. Cross-platform media means distributing the same product, or nearly the same, to different platforms, and multimedia refers to a single work that incorporates multiple different mediums into the one piece. But transmedia gets at the core idea of how media today is interconnected, how each piece of a franchise can contribute to what Jenkins calls our additive comprehension of a universe. It reflects the modern economics of media consolidation, in which large conglomerates have a hand in multiple platforms all used to expand its brand and franchises. Which brings us to convergence, a broad term used to describe this technological and industrial shift. Media convergence encapsulates how previously distinct aspects of the media world are merging, from content distribution across multiple platforms to interconnected media industries, to the technology that allows us to consume a variety of media all in the palm of our hand. But Jenkins argues that convergence is not just an economic or technological process, but actually a shift in cultural logic. He looks at convergence culture in terms of how individual consumers are encouraged to become participants, actively making connections between the fragments of information we consume. It's a fascinating perspective on how we assimilate information and then contribute our perspective to a collective intelligence, a convergence of minds making meaning. So, transmedia convergence strikes at that cultural and industrial movement to cooperatively use multiple media forms to tell stories, engaging consumers in a world so robust that it becomes an experience to discover, discuss, and immerse yourself in. And of course, that you'll keep paying money to consume. By my judgment, only a few franchises have achieved this to its fullest extent. I'm talking about well-known and deeply fleshed out universes like Marvel and Star Wars, where there always seems to be another layer, another character, another story to weave into the tapestry. Even Harry Potter, for all that it's trying to become the complex wizarding world it boasts, still relies too heavily on its original material, and each attempt to stretch beyond the core books is met with mixed reviews, although its commercial success is still undeniable. But for comics, whether on a Marvel scale or not, transmedia convergence has played a key role in both their pop culture prevalence and the slow shift towards seeing comics as legitimate art and literature. Perhaps the most visible and understandable aspect of franchise convergence is adaptation, or reimagining a story in a different medium. The logic is simple enough. If consumers like the story in one form, they'll probably pay to see it in another. Because of that built-in fan base, adaptations are a more secure investment. Publishers and production companies alike know it will attract an audience, all without having to gamble on the success of new original works. Not to mention, adaptations are also usually cheaper to produce because the source material cuts down on writing and creative costs. So, economically speaking, adaptations are a smart, efficient way to utilize existing material to increase profit. But more than just another opportunity to profit from the existing fan base, adaptations hope to attract both longtime fans and new consumers. Each new medium offers a new entry point for consumers who may be interested in a franchise. For example, a film adaptation of a novel is an entry point for moviegoers who may not be as interested in reading. If done successfully, a good adaptation will bring readers to the theater and send satisfied moviegoers to the bookstore, looking to read the film's inspiration. And it doesn't stop there. The hope is that the movie fan will read the book and then start looking to read more, inviting them to consume similar media in the future. That way, not only does the franchise reach the largest audience it can, but also creates consumers for future content. This cross-pollination between mediums and industries is a lot of what Convergence is about. Now, to be considered transmedia, an adaptation has to contribute to the larger universe or understanding of the franchise. If an adaptation just regurgitates the original, or if it derails from the source material completely, then some may argue that it isn't transmedia. And they've got a point. Not all adaptations are made with the franchise in mind, and it may be better to regard them as related but separate entities. I'm looking at you, Percy Jackson movie. But often, faithful adaptations are still transmedia because of the choices that must be made in order to adapt the story. Moving from one medium to another forces creators to choose how to best tell that story in that form, and along the way, their decisions add to the world. At a minimum, going from a novel to a comic or a film adds visuals, which means that creators must present concrete images to replace what had been previously imagined. From characters to settings, the process of rendering description into visuals creates a new canon for how the world can be perceived. Each included detail, from what hangs on the wall in the protagonist's bedroom to what each character wears, works to characterize the story and fleshes out the world in ways that make it slowly become more complete and vivid. And well-done visuals do a lot more than just represent reality. To paraphrase NPR comics blogger Glenn Weldon, a good graphic novel adaptation doesn't just copy the book's prose and put pictures around it. A graphic novel needs to create tension between the texts and images. Because of the economy of words, the art in graphic novel adaptations does a lot of the storytelling work, from setting the tone through color and lines to controlling the pacing with frames and gutters. It goes back to what we discussed earlier with visual literacy and how the building blocks of visual language can be used and experimented with. Comics tell stories through that juxtaposition of visuals and text, making meaning from what their association implies. One of the most poignant examples of this is the graphic novel adaptation of Anne Frank's diary by Ari Folman and David Polonsky. Folman and Polonsky approached the adaptation as a way to supplement the original diary with visuals, attempting to interpret Anne's words as she wrote them. In one panel, the text from her diary reads that the bad thoughts creep into her mind at night, and Polonsky's illustration imagines the nightmares that haunt her, representing the looming Nazi threat as a gray horde, faces menacing behind every pillar, and red smoke weaving around and suffocating her sleeping four. It may not be hard for readers to guess at what bad thoughts might keep Anne up at night, but the graphic novel's interpretation paints an evocative picture of the very real darkness in her life, juxtaposed beautifully with the bright colors of what her childhood once was. It's that artful interpretation that gives value to the adaptation, what reviews call an exceptionally graceful homage. Granted, with all adaptations, it's up to the consumer to decide whether or not they accept that interpretation as their own canon, but simply by existing, each adapted interpretation contributes to how we conceptualize the story. Even by rejecting the interpretation, we better define our understanding of the material, which almost personalizes the story through our own perception of what it is and what it means. Similarly, adapting from comic to film adds audio and movement, adding an auditory interpretation of the material as well as filling in the motion between the gutters. While audio additions are often more understated or subtle than visual components, voice actors and sound effects breathe life into the world, and music guides our mood while watching, drawing us into an immersive space. One recent example that I was particularly impressed by was the Prowler sound effect from Into the Spider-Verse. With each appearance of the dangerous threat, the sound heralds Miles Morales' panic, building tension with each repetition. But in the end, that sound becomes the introduction to the song What's Up, Danger, the theme that plays when Miles steps up, takes the plunge, and embraces his role as Spider-Man. The song itself is an empowering anthem, but it's all the more because it starts with the Prowler's growl, showing that Miles isn't running from his fear, but confronting it. That sound and that song may not be able to translate back into comic form, but that interpretation can remain in the consciousness of the consumer. I know I'll be hearing it anytime I read about Miles. Now, adaptations don't have to be transmedia in order to grow or strengthen the franchise. There's still profit to be made, whether or not the adaptation adds to the franchise's universe. But more and more, industries are looking for ways to create adaptations and spin-offs that are transmedia, because they offer new content to entice returning fans, who may not be willing to pay if there's nothing new to see. Many authors and consumers alike don't see the value in rehashing an old story when there's much more opportunity, and sales, in prequels, sequels, or side stories about characters or plots that haven't had a chance at the limelight. Even television hit The Walking Dead, which could have just been a straight adaptation of the comic series, makes an effort to make adjustments to make the series more compelling for the audience. Robert Kirkman, creator of the series, has openly discussed their willingness to explore how the show takes a different shape by shifting events, or adding certain characters, or removing certain characters. As he sees it, the difference is put a fresh coat of paint on it, keeping the core story intact, while contributing new material as well. Beyond these adaptations, one transmedia trend that's particularly taken off in the past couple decades is the existence of tie-in comic books. Tie-in comics are literally comics that tie in to a franchise, usually serving as either a companion work, a spin-off, or a continuation of the main series. Expansive multimedia universes like Marvel and DC obviously make use of tie-ins, such as the Shuri comic about T'Challa's sister that came out after Black Panther, and DC's comic tie-in to Injustice: Gods Among Us, revealing the lore behind the 2013 fighting game. But it's hardly surprising that Marvel and DC create comic tie-ins for their other media. Comics is what they do. I find it much more interesting that some franchises that began on screen have also found their way to tie-in comics. Cartoon Network's animated hit Adventure Time has a non-canonical comic book series which ran for about 6 years, and a number of graphic novel standalones and spin-off miniseries. And, with the show's conclusion, a new comic series called Season 11 picks up right where the show's finale ended. Both Avatar: The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra, animated television shows from Nickelodeon, have similarly published comics to continue the show's story after they ended, and popular adult animation Rick and Morty has a spin-off comic series starring alternate universe versions of the show's protagonists. Even video games like Bloodborne and Life is Strange have sparked comic series based on or continuing the stories beyond the game. To some extent, the jump from animation to comics makes obvious sense. Comics allow an animated series or video game to maintain a similar art style and visual form of storytelling, all while saving on the cost of animation and audio, from music to voice actors. For video game tie-ins, the comics also obviously lose interactivity, but comics offer an opportunity to expand on the world's lore. All in all, it's a smooth transition for viewers who'd like to see more from the universe. But some media tie-in comics are based on live-action shows, such as comics in the Firefly and Doctor Who franchises, and without an animation style to imitate, all the real-life actors have to be illustrated. Typically, the creators choose a hyper-realistic art style when adapting live-action to comics, trying to mimic their actual appearance as close as possible. But unfortunately, in my opinion, they're also way too close to the uncanny valley for comfort. So why do it? Why add comics into a franchise, especially if the original medium is still publishing content, and the comics will remain questionably canonical? Well, in many ways, it's just smart business, and marketing synergy at its finest. As we've already noted, building a transmedia franchise is all about taking advantage of each potential medium to maximize profit. But more than simply creating extra content, these additions to the series are about providing entry points to consumers that may be interested in the source material. It's not a coincidence that many of the live-action or video game comic spin-offs are science fiction and fantasy. They branch into comics because they're trying to reach that audience, those who read comics, and who are often already familiar and interested in the genres. And these entry points become more and more important as a franchise gets increasingly long and complex. Long-running franchises like Doctor Who have so much content that it can be intimidating and confusing for new consumers. But spin-offs or reboots of the series give interested people a new avenue into the bigger franchise. And, as useful as comic spin-offs are for the franchises, these entry points are especially important for comic books and graphic novels, which have long held a bit of social stigma, seen as nerdy, childish, or just entertainment. Granted, that stigma has definitely begun to change. Graphic novels have shown that comics have a place in literary fiction and nonfiction, And interest in the more traditional comic book stories, the science fiction and fantasy, is practically more mainstream than ever. But a lot of that changing perspective on comics is a byproduct of transmedia convergence, as adaptations create new entry points to the medium. Graphic novel adaptations like Anne Frank's Diary, Fahrenheit 451, and The Handmaid's Tale not only make significant literature more accessible, but also introduce readers to the potential of comics. In the words of Scholastic creative director David Saylor, creating graphic novel adaptations of successful properties, for them like The Babysitter's Club and Goosebumps, provides an opportunity to overcome an early resistance to graphic novels in a marketplace that sometimes sees comics as a lesser version of prose. By adapting already beloved and respected literary works, graphic novels gain credibility and critical reception, and those adaptations become an entry point for readers who may have otherwise dismissed comics' potential to be serious literature. Meanwhile, as those adaptations solidify comics' value as a medium, film and TV adaptations of comics help legitimize the stories that began as comics. The Walking Dead has dominated television ratings over the past near decade, and Marvel has become an unassailable Hollywood blockbuster powerhouse. From Sin City to Parasopolis to every DC television series, the stories began as comics, and the franchises have used their screen adaptations as entry points to bring new consumers into the robust, already existing world of comics. Marvel's particularly good at that, such as releasing Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, the month before Spider-Man Homecoming opened, pairing that comic iteration to match the movie's lighter tone. That way, as the movie release spikes interest in its source material, new fans discover the potential stories awaiting them in comic book shops just around the corner. Now, stay tuned. We're going to pick this discussion right back up next episode as we dive into a case study on unorthodox adaptations and how transmedia convergence can work to help independent creators expand their brand in a competitive market. See you soon.